name is Ed Mead, and I'm a state-raised former prisoner. I started doing time at the age of 13 in the Utah State Industrial School for boys because Alaska didn't have where I was from, Fairbanks, didn't have a juvenile facility at the time, and they didn't even have a prison at the time. And that started me on a life of petty crime. And in 1960, around 1968, somewhere, the mid to late 60s, I was after a whole series of crimes, I wound up in the United States Penitentiary at MacNeil Island, Washington. And it was there in 1971 that I became politicized. And I started studying politics. And when I was released, in I guess around 72, 74, somewhere in there, I and another prisoner organized the Washington State Prisoners Labor Union. We believed, and I continue to believe, that change on the inside, real change, significant change, some token reforms can come down from the top, but real change, enforceable change, comes from the empowerment of prisoners from the bottom up. And so that has been the focus of prison focus, is to try to help empower prisoners, and we've done so most recently through the series of hunger strikes, in which on the first day of the last strike there were 33,000 prisoners participating and another 2,600 refusing to work. Now, the only way that the prisons in California, or anywhere for that matter, can function is if the prisoners perform non-custody functions such as scrubbing the floors, mowing the lawns, cooking the meals, serving the food. All of this stuff is done by prisoners. If prisoners withheld their labor, as they have a right to under the United Nations International Declaration of Human Rights, then they could bargain, they could organize, they could bring about change. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished slavery for everyone, except those convicted of a crime. So we still have legalized slavery in America for 2.3 million people. The 13th Amendment must be abolished to eliminate the slavery provision, because for as long as the courts and state attitudes regard prisoners as slaves of the states, things are not going to improve. Being convicted of a crime does not deprive you of your civil rights, such as the right to vote, but across the board, prisoners are disenfranchised from the political process that one would think you would want to get them more involved with, but that evidently is not the case. So you'll see here, well, I guess I took it off of this one. But it is elsewhere in the paper. Working to extend democracy to all. And as I said, there's 2.3 million people who are disenfranchised from the political process. If prisoners were allowed to vote, most of these prisons are located in remote areas, and the local politicians would just be clamoring for the prisoner vote. I mean, the block of votes by prisoners things would change relatively fast if prisoners had the right to vote. That's what I'm trying to say. Things would change relatively fast also if the status of prisoners was different than that of slave. Now, I know a lot of people will think this is a really uphill struggle, but I remember not too long ago when interracial marriages were a crime in many states. Things that seemed almost unachievable in the past, with the passage of time and struggle, are achievable. Look at the gay rights movement. How long ago was it that that the notion of gay marriage was so foreign as to be laughable? And now, in a huge number of states, it is legal, and that has been the focus of trying to move prisoners, from the bottom, organize them from the bottom up, We can't really organize them. All we can do is encourage them to organize themselves. We're not going to be able to organize the prisoners from the streets. First of all, they wouldn't have it, and we shouldn't have it either. But we can support them. Now, there is a tendency on the inside that would like us to fight their struggle for them, but we can't do that. We can only support. Our role out here is to amplify their voice. Well, I was arrested for being a member of the George Jackson Brigade during a failed bank robbery. We called it bank expropriation. And I was ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison. When I arrived at the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla, they placed me directly in the hole. So I was being booked into the segregation unit. It's called it's a SHU, Security Housing Unit. So I was being booked in, and in front of me there was a kid, I don't know, 20 years old or something like that. I think I was around 33 or 34 at the time. And I didn't talk to him, didn't pay any attention to him. I was in my own head, as I'm sure he was. So the guards, they take your clothes, lift up your nutsack, bend over, spread your cheeks, naked. A humiliating experience, but it's one that you get used to. And so we were placed on B tier of the seg unit. I was in cell 10, he was in cell 11. I went into the cell, and there were boogers on the bars and boogers on the walls everywhere. There was fecal matter smeared on the walls in huge patches like that, all around. And I asked the guard for some cleaning equipment so I could clean my cell. He says that can only be done on a day shift, and all it was is just a lazy guard, They probably put me in there on purpose because I didn't like them. So this is my first night, and about 7 o'clock that night, I'm sitting in there. I've been cleaning up as best I could with what I had, using toilet paper or whatnot, and I heard a commotion in the cell next to me. And I went over to the bars and looked over, and it was a group of about 6 prisoners who were trying to get into this kid's cell in order to rape him. Because at Walla Walla at the time, that is how you established your place in the pecking order, is by buying and selling or raping more vulnerable prisoners made you more of a man. And I didn't know that, but and when there was the guard at the end of there were times of huge conflict within that segregation unit and times of peace, and this was a time of peace. And the guards want to get along. When there's times of conflict, the prisoners are throwing shit and piss and all kinds of other mixtures onto the guards as they come onto the tier. And so they want to get along. They want everything to go smoothly. And so here's the guard at the end of the tier trying to get this kid's cell open so these guys can get in. Well, the kid is sticking a hardcover book in between the door and the bars so it won't open. And then this gang of rapists grab for the book, he pulls it back, the guard tries to open the door, he pushes the book in, and this goes on for a little while, and I'm saying to him, oh my, I need to say, stop, you villains, this is wrong. But I'm afraid they're going to come try and get in my cell if I say something. One of them goes down to the sink at the end of the tier and gets a pitcher of hot water and throws it in on the prisoner. But that doesn't work either. The guard tires of the whole thing, and the prisoners disperse and go back to their cells or do whatever they do. These were, your exercise period is when you get out on the tier. And so, and you get out of your cell and get to walk the tier for 1 hour. And so that's what it's like. There was a kid further down the tier while I was in there. 2 guys went in and raped. He's a young kid. 2 guys. They gave him some drugs, went in and raped him, told him to go take a shower. He did. They came back, and they strangled him to death and hung and hung a sheet around the bars to make it look like he had committed suicide. And one of the guys that did that has since been released. I mean, you know, never caught. I mean, just so that's what it's like. It's cannibalism, and that's what it was like when I went in there. But we were able to turn it around completely. Turn it around. When you take a group of rats and overcrowd them, they develop aberrant behaviors, and I think that's pretty much the same if you treat, you know, with human beings. So we organized a struggle within the segregation unit, and there were 4 tiers, 24 cells on each tier, and we put out a newsletter. We communicated with the population as best we could, and as a result of this, the population went on strike. They listed 14 demands. The first demand on the list was to rectify conditions in the security housing unit. That strike went on for 47 days, and during all that time, it was a major news story within the state of Washington, on the radio, in the newspapers, television. Prison officials were interviewed, guards were interviewed, talking heads were interviewed, other talking heads. In all that time, in like 43 days, not a single prisoner was interviewed or even asked what this was about. On about day 44, the George Jackson Brigade bombed 2 Rainier banks, issued a communique pointing out the interlocking directorship between the Rainier banks and the Seattle Times, the city's major newspaper, and pointed out that during all of this time, this long strike, not a single prisoner had been interviewed, nor any hint given that the prisoners might have an issue. They were just... So, reporters, of course, don't like to think of themselves as mouthpieces for the ruling class, you know, which they actually are. So they went out and interviewed a couple prisoners. On day 47, the strike ended. Harold Bradley, the Director of Corrections for the state of Washington, was fired. B.J. Ray, the warden of the Washington State Penitentiary, was removed. The Associate Warden of Custody, Harvey, was sent to the kids' joint at Shelton. And we, who call ourselves the Walla Walla Brothers, were released to the general population, where we went on to form Men Against Sexism and put an end to the practice of prisoner-on-prisoner rape and the buying and selling of prisoners by other prisoners. We did this through a lot of means. We were ultimately able to get the administration to recognize MAS and to give us an air-conditioned office inside the prison. That's how powerful we queers were in Walla Walla at that time. I mean, prisoners could wear dresses, lipstick. They drew the line when I went and told the associate warden I wanted panties. They said, no, that's not happening. That ultimately the problem of crime and punishment can't be solved within the context of the existing social order. That it would require a radical transformation of existing class relations in order to bring about the kind of changes needed in order to abolish crime. Wherever you find pockets of poverty, you're going to find high levels of crime. And given the inequality of income in the United States, we're going to continue to have that. You can focus on the individual as much as you want, but it's a systemic problem, and it can't be solved. There are 2.3 million prisoners in the United States. There are 14.7 million ex-convicts on the streets under some form of supervision, parole, probation, house arrest, whatever you want to call it. And then there are the friends and family members of that, what is now about 14, 15, 16, almost 20 million people. I mean, the resources there, the strength is there to bring this movement to fruition. We just need, well, if I knew what we needed, I would be doing it. But we definitely need, prisoners need to be at the point of this spear. And everything that they need to do, and what we need to emphasize to them is nonviolence. It's their peaceful protest that will that will ultimately prevail. Their unity. If they have the unity, they can shut them down for an extended period of time. That'll bring the state to its knees, and then this conversation can start happening on a real equal footing. And so that's where we need to go, in my opinion, in order to bring about the kind of changes that need to be brought about on the inside. The reps in August of 2012 issued this agreement to end hostilities, signed by all the gang members, leaders, and sent it out. And we published it and in the Rock and in Prison Focus and sent it out throughout California prisons. And as a result of that, prisoner-on-prisoner violence, particularly gang-related violence, has dropped to negligible. So that's where things stand right now. We're at a difficult point right now because CDCR, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, has skillfully defeated these struggles by the prisoners in the segregation unit. I mean, they've done a lot. The number of people in the SHU are down. A lot of them have been released to population, and so there has been, and people within the SHU units have, pull-up bars and more access to television and stuff like that, even though they're locked in their cells 23 hours a day or more. So the strikes did do some good, but they didn't do enough good. And what needs to happen is that the prisoners in the general population need to be engaged. I have my own agenda, and that is the 5 core demands of the SHU prisoners, the SHU conditions, freeing people from the SHU. Hopefully, it's unrealistic at this point, but to turn those into minimum security units where people can, come and go and eliminate the SHU altogether. I think it's very important to inform the public. The public does not understand. It's just like the issue of gay marriage. How once a fulcrum point was reached, public opinion rapidly shifted. Now it's getting up to that fulcrum point that's the difficult part. But the point is, if you were in an auditorium of everyday people and you ask, how many of you support slavery, the slavery of millions of people in America? Raise your hands. I don't think you see a lot of hands. If you ask how many people do you think it's okay to disenfranchise millions of Americans from the political process? Raise your hand. And I don't think many hands would raise either. Right and justice are on the side of prisoners. What's being done to them is wrong. And the people, the criminologists, everyone, they only look at the individual. They don't look at the social context in which that individual came from. I would do the layout of these different publications I was doing. I would type it out in columns and then cut and paste onto a sheet of paper, and then have those photocopied, so put whiteout in between. You probably don't know what whiteout is these days, but anyway, it's all hand layout. And the same way with the mailing list, which was about 600 people, and they put me in the hole, as they often do whenever I go someplace. In fact, it kept me locked up a lot. I was in one 4-year period. I was at 8 prisons in 5 states. I'm in Monroe, and I'm in the hole. And after about 10 months, they come to me and say, "We'll let you out." I'm also filing lawsuits over being placed in segregation for no reason at all, and no means of getting out. Blah blah blah. So anyway, they said, make a long story short, they said, you can get out, but you have to go to work or go to school. So I didn't want to work for them, so I said, okay, I'll go to school. And I took a computer class. I don't know why. I didn't even know what computers were. And lo and behold, I discovered word processing, where I could take a column of text and woo, it would just flow into the next columns. And I could cut and paste. I'd found Jesus. And so I signed up for every computer class I could get. And that wasn't enough. I became the teacher's aide. So I was working with computers all day now. But that still wasn't enough. I wanted one of these suckers in my cell. And so I started a campaign to allow prisoners who could buy them with their own money to have a computer in their cell. And needless to say, when I started this campaign, I was laughed at by everybody, prisoners and administration alike. I wrote proposals. I did, you know, when a high-level administrator would be going through the prison on tour, I would latch onto his leg like a bulldog. They just, you know, why? Just tell me why this can't happen. Finally, one of them said, "Okay, write me a policy. I'll write me a draft policy, and we'll see what we can do." So I wrote a policy, and this is after 2.5 years. And we were allowed to have computers. They authorized us to have computers in our cell. There were 52 of us that had computers, and you know, we did a lot of work. I would have a guard would walk by, and I would have my computer using fingernail clipper and tweezers. I would have the motherboard out of that thing, everything tore it apart. I was like a 16-year-old kid trying to get another mile an hour out of his hot rod. I mean, I was just into this, you know, really, I've been into law, I've been into politics, and now I was really into computers. And we started a prisoners user group called PUG, Prisoners User Group. And we had outside user group people come in and meet with us. And so we had these computers in our cells, I don't know, about 3 years. And there had never been a computer-related infraction. One of the things PUG did was start an anecdotal database of prisoners who had had computers in their cells and had been released, whether they had come back or not. Not a single prisoner went out and they started their own computer business. They went to work for another computer business or in some aspect of the computer line, and not a one of these people returned at no cost to the state. I was released, and they took the computers. There was no infraction. They just the public perception, what we talked about earlier, was that this was coddling prisoners. And so here was a group of prisoners that had no recidivism at no cost to the state, and yet they shut it down because of appearances. And that's the kind of thing that was. So I got pretty smart with computers, and I was released shortly after that. And I worked, when I got out, I did temp work for temporary employment agencies, figuring that someone would recognize my knowledge and qualities. And that was the case. I lost some jobs because they found out about my record. But ultimately, I got a job as a network administrator, and then I got a call to go down to San Francisco to do a job for this company down there. I went down there and did it, and I took a couple months. I came back, and about 3 months later, they called me up and said, "How would you like to work for us permanently at a rate of just right around $50,000 a year at that time?" And I was making 37. And so I told my boss, who I really liked, and who liked me, you know, "Can you match this?" And he said, "No, I can't." And I said, "Nah, I don't want to leave, but there's no retirement plan here, and they have a 401k, and, you know, I'm pretty old. I need to start thinking about my old age." So in California, there's a 70% recidivism rate. There's also a 70% jobless rate among ex-offenders, ex-cons. I mean, jobs are one of the things that are going to turn this around. People need, you know, meaningful work when they get out. Learning how to, you know, serve food on the main line is not making you employable, and especially when you have the handicap of a criminal record on you. So they just do. If you had a factory that produced a product with a 70% failure rate, your stockholders would rebel. The public wouldn't buy your stuff. It would just, you know. But these people aren't held accountable. They're not asked to look for ways that can bring this down, or when ways that can bring recidivism down are brought to them, such as the computer program. Oh, that's coddling prisoners. So it's all about the punishment. And let me tell your readers or watchers here that I have an advanced stage lung cancer, and I'm on chemo and taking different drugs. And so my mind is not as sharp, or it's not the steel trap that it normally is. I have a book coming out probably this summer about my life as a political activist for prisoners. I think that's all I have to say.